Hello, and welcome to HemiScope. I'm Peter Smith, Professor of Latin American Studies here at the University of California, San Diego. Tonight, we'll begin our program with an essay on the year in review for Latin America. And then we'll turn to Vicente Fox of Mexico and assess his first year as president with two well-known experts. After that, it's La Época Dorada, a look at the golden age of Mexican cinema. And then, finally, Christmas in Cuba. 2001 has been a topsy-turvy year for Latin America. It seemed to start on a positive note. Vicente Fox had been sworn in as president after defeating Mexico's official party in the most democratic elections in that nation's history. Alberto Fujimori fell from power in Peru. Subsequent elections led to the reinstatement of democracy, and a new government promised to dismantle the spy network that had been the basis of Fujimori's autocratic rule. In the meantime, George W. Bush was inaugurated as President of the United States, the first president in decades to proclaim that Latin America would be a top priority for his administration. In April, at a hemispheric summit meeting in Quebec City, President Bush announced plans to proceed with the formation of a free trade area of the Americas, and he declared that he would soon seek Trade Promotion Authority, formerly known as Fast Track Authority, that would limit Congress to an up or down vote on commercial treaties, rather than allowing it to add potentially crippling amendments. Bush also continued to cultivate a close personal relationship with Vicente Fox, who ardently pressed his case for relaxation of restrictions on Mexican immigration to the United States. But warning signs soon appeared. By mid-year, the slowdown in the U.S. economy began to take its toll on Latin American countries, which tended to rely on American consumers for export earnings and on American investors for infusions of capital. Commodity prices also began to slide as supply exceeded demand. To the utter astonishment of many observers, Vietnam emerged as the world's second largest producer of coffee, well behind Brazil, but ahead of countries such as Colombia. And as a result of the glut in production, prices dropped from an average of 95 cents per pound in December 1999 to merely 45 cents per pound in recent weeks, which has meant serious losses for coffee farmers in Mexico, Central America, Peru, and especially Colombia, where coffee accounts for nearly 10% of all exports. The creeping global recession also led to a reduction in demand for petroleum, so prices of oil skidded downward, inflicting pain on countries like Mexico and Venezuela. Then came the tragic events of September 11th. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon have had serious effects, not only in the United States and on its relationship with the world, but also upon Latin America. First, Latin America suddenly slipped toward the bottom of U.S. foreign policy priorities. As the Bush administration focused its anti-terrorist campaign, especially that on the Middle East and South and Central Asia, Latin America seemed to lose importance. One conspicuous casualty of this change was the evaporation of Vicente Fox's hope for more lenient U.S. treatment of immigrants from Mexico. On the contrary, the anti-terrorist strategy came to include lengthy and costly security checks at the U.S.-Mexican border. Immigration reform would simply have to wait. Second, Latin America suffered from the economic fallout of the September 11th attacks. Tourism plummeted everywhere, inflicting substantial losses on Mexico and countries of the Caribbean, including Cuba. Airlines suffered as well. As the U.S. recession deepened, Latin American exports to the U.S. market declined, and as an atmosphere of caution gripped international markets, U.S. investors withdrew their capital from Latin America. As a result of all these trends, Latin America finds itself in dire economic straits. Mexico is now in recession and is likely to register zero economic growth for the year 2001. Argentina continues to teeter on the brink of default on its debt. Brazil is facing a shortage of foreign capital, one that threatens to weaken the value of its currency, the real. According to Enrique Iglesias, the widely respected president of the Inter-American Development Bank, Latin America is facing one of its most difficult periods in many decades. This is a devastating outcome for a region as poor as Latin America. Indeed, one recent survey shows that nearly 44% of all Latin Americans are living in poverty. Between 1990 and 1999, a decade of extensive free market reform, the population living in poverty rose by 11 million people. As of now, more than half of Latin America's children and teenagers are growing up poor. Unemployment is on the rise too. Nearly 9% of the working age population is out of work. If measured as in the United States, by the way, these figures would be a good deal higher. In some countries, unemployment in cities has reached staggering heights. Over 15% in Colombia and Argentina, over 10% in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Uruguay, and around 9% in Chile, long heralded as the great success story of the 1990s. This panorama has disturbing implications. One is that the benefits of economic reform have yet to reach the masses of Latin America. Understandably, some analysts wonder if they ever will. Another is that democracy has not led to material improvements in the lives of everyday citizens. It goes without saying that both of these trends could have serious consequences on the future of the region. In the meantime, Latin Americans have reacted to these and related developments with remarkable resilience. In Central America, at least, citizens show that they have not been seeking radical utopian or populist solutions. In a recent presidential election, voters in Nicaragua favored conservative businessman Enrique Bolaños over Daniel Ortega, leader of the Sandinistas, by a margin of more than 10 points. And in neighboring Honduras, voters ousted a ruling party in favor of another businessman, Ricardo Maduro. In both countries, the campaigns focused on nitty-gritty issues of crime, corruption, clean government. Also in November, leaders of Latin America met with their counterparts from Spain and Portugal in an Ibero-American summit gathering held in Lima, Peru. In a unanimous declaration, the 21 heads of state vowed, quote, to fight acts of terrorism wherever they occur and whoever may carry them out. They did not, however, express explicit support for the U.S.-led military campaign in Afghanistan, stressing instead the importance of a global campaign against terrorism conducted within the framework of the United Nations. They also pledged to strengthen ties between Europe and Latin America, noting that Spain will assume the presidency of the European Union in early 2002, in fact. The Spanish Prime Minister asserted that the development of European links to Latin America, quote, will be an absolutely strategic component for us. If the United States is too busy to deal with Latin America, in other words, Europe would be pleased to fill the void. Yet another intriguing outcome related to Cuba. For the first time since the inception of these summit meetings in 1991, Fidel Castro was absent, claiming that he was preoccupied by devastation from Hurricane Michelle. Predictably enough, the absence raised eyebrows and questions about the health of Cuba's 75-year-old leader. But he nonetheless won a victory in absentia, as the heads of state urged the United States to rescind the Helms-Burton Act, which essentially penalizes foreign companies for doing business with Cuba. In fact, Hurricane Michelle, the worst storm to hit Cuba in half a century, had other consequences too. Faced by this catastrophe, Havana appealed to Washington for rapid permission to buy food and medicine on a one-time basis in order to replenish depleted stocks. As a result, several American companies, including Archer Daniels Midland, announced trade accords of about $20 million for food shipments to Cuba. To some, it seemed that these deals might put a crack in the decades-old U.S. embargo of Cuba. As one former State Department official suggested, the hurricane seems to have broken the logjam. That will remain to be seen. So what should we anticipate in the coming year? I long ago learned to avoid hard and fast predictions about a region as challenging and fascinating as Latin America. Even so, let me identify some signposts for the future. One will be a decision by the U.S. Congress, or lack of a decision, on trade promotion authority. In fact, this might occur within the coming weeks or even days. For critics, the key issues relate to guarantees on labor rights and environmental protection. TPA will be essential to prospects for a free trade area of the Americas. Without it, the idea of a hemispheric free trade zone is likely to remain stillborn. A second signpost will be the Brazilian presidential elections of October 2002. As the largest country of Latin America and the continental leader of South America, Brazil plays a crucial role in inter-American affairs. Third will be developments within Colombia, a country whose government has been severely challenged by radical guerrilla groups and drug traffickers, and often by alliances between the two. The United States recently awarded a $1.3 billion aid package to Colombia, primarily for military assistance, allegedly for use against drug traffickers, though some will no doubt be siphoned off for use in that country's decades-long civil war. Whether Colombia will survive these obstacles or descend to the ranks of failed states will be a matter of pressing concern. Fourth, and most broadly, let us listen and urge our leaders to listen to the voices of Latin American peoples. Dismissed by stereotype as rabid nationalists and hot-headed revolutionaries, Latin American citizens have shown conspicuous restraint in recent years. But that does not mean they are content. It means that they are searching for ways of expressing their needs, for ways of seeking redress, for ways of gaining the dignity that they deserve. In the year ahead, and in the years beyond, the art of listening will be important for us all. We turn now to an assessment of Mexican President Vicente Fox after 1 year on the job. Vicente Fox defied the odds when he ran as the nominee of the opposition party, the PAN, and won, ending the PRI's 70-year grip on the Mexican presidency. Hopes were high for this new president, this brilliant campaigner who had traveled across the country promising to bust the drug cartels and improve the nation's economy. President Fox also made much of his friendship with U.S. President George W. Bush. When Mr. Bush visited the Fox Ranch in Guanajuato in February, the two presidents focused on cooperation.
Presidente, I want you to know that we consider you a friend of Mexico, a friend of Mexican people, and a friend of mine.
We need to work together on the drug issue. One of the reasons why drugs are shipped, the main reason why drugs are shipped through Mexico to the United States is because United States citizens use drugs. And our nation must do a better job of educating our citizenry about the dangers and evils of drug use.
The migration of Mexican workers has long been an issue between the two countries. And when President Fox visited Washington in early September, he asked Mr. Bush to find a way to open the border to those who want to work in the United States. While President Bush was sympathetic at the time, the terrorist attacks on the United States that followed have all but killed the Fox request. And so, with Mexico in a recession and with no visible progress in solving the country's biggest problems, how do the voters see the man who took office 1 year ago? Joining me to discuss this are Roderic, a professor of political science at Claremont McKenna College in Los Angeles, and Denise Dresser, a Mexican political scientist and visiting fellow at the University of Southern California's Pacific Council on International Policy. Welcome both of you to HemiScope. And Denise, let me ask you this question about Vicente Fox's popularity. His national approval ratings seem to be holding up, although we'll know more when some new polls are soon to be published. But other polls raise questions. One has to do with whether Mexico as a country is on the right path. And in December of 2000, when he was inaugurated, over 3/4 said Mexico was on the right path. Now it's less than 40%. In Mexico City, polls about his approval ratings show also a very sharp decline over the recent months, to the point where he is far behind the opposition mayor of Mexico City in approval ratings. In fact, his approval and disapproval ratings within Mexico City are more or less equal. So let me ask you this. Is he in trouble, Vicente Fox, or is he heading for trouble?
I don't think he's in deep trouble yet. He certainly has slipped in terms of his overall approval ratings, in certain respects due to forces beyond his control, largely the economy, the American recession, the events of September 11th and their impact on U.S.-Mexico relations. And Vicente Fox has also had trouble translating the promises that he made during his campaign into concrete realities. And the public is beginning to view this and to punish him for it. Not to a degree where he's facing any severe governance problems, but to a degree where paralysis looms large as a problem that Mexico could eventually face throughout his term.
Rod, let me ask you then, you've done public opinion polling yourself. How do you think Mexican citizens see Vicente Fox as a personality? That is, there is some suggestion in some recent news reports that he's a little bit too folkloric, that the qualities that made him a great campaigner don't look sufficiently, as we would say in this country, presidential. Is there anything to that?
Well, I think there's something to that as far as perhaps the educated public is concerned, and there have been individuals who have suggested that President Fox needs to pay closer attention to what he says publicly as distinct from what he says privately. And I think the other issue you raise is that if you analyze why people voted for Mr. Fox in this past election, which was essentially focused on the issue of change, I think that's why you get a disparity between his popularity ratings and is Mexico on the right path. That is, Mr. Fox hasn't produced the kind of expectations that people had as far as their definition of what change meant. And I think that's the crux of his problem as far as how he's viewed on public opinion polls.
When he was elected and took office, did he have a mandate for any specific set of policies? That is, was there a menu of policy decisions he was supposed to realize? Or had he really achieved what he was supposed to achieve by getting elected, by throwing the PRI out of the presidential office?
I would actually say not. If you compare
not a mandate.
Not a mandate. If you compare what the issues that were important in 2000 with the issues that were important 6 years earlier in the presidential race, they were basically the same. Poverty, the economy, and personal security. But people didn't rate Mr. Fox or his opponent, his leading opponent, Mr. Labastida, any differently in their abilities to solve those issues. What they really were interested in is converting Mexico to a democracy, and which candidates symbolized the ability to bring about that change. And when he won the election, people suddenly moved from a position of maybe 40% or so thinking that Mexico had a democracy to a week later, 60% thinking that Mexico had a democracy.
Right, and that was partly those who answered that Mexico was on a good path over a year ago.
That's correct.
But now, if they're thinking about economic or other issues, they're a little less certain, at least one suggests. Denise, you raised a question about forces beyond his control. Let's go through some of the issues that seem to be dogging him now. One, as you said, is the economy and contingent and consequent unemployment. The economy very largely contingent on performance of the United States, so therefore this is something he can't control. But what about issues that he could control, theoretically? For example, Chiapas. For example, tax reform. For example, reform of the criminal justice system. Can you take us through some of those questions and guide us to an understanding of how he has and has not handled these questions?
Well, what you have to understand about the Fox government is that it's a divided government. This is a system in which the president and his party do not control Congress, a system in which the opposition still has the capacity to veto presidential initiatives. So, although Fox has had an ambitious agenda and has tried to push it forward, at critical junctures, there have been obstacles in his path, namely those placed by his foes in Congress, some of whom come from within his own party. And I'd say that's been the principal problem to Mexico actually moving ahead in terms of the agenda that Fox had. He has a very bad relationship with Congress. He has not been able to work out a political consensus with opposition forces and even with forces in his own party who distrust his caudillo, folkloric political style. And that has meant that on topics such as Chiapas, which he promised to bring about peace in the state in 10 minutes, and then it turned out that his party wasn't even willing to support the peace initiative that he had put on the table for the state. Or fiscal reform, where his party and the PRI and the left-wing opposition party, the PRD, do not have the same interpretation as to what sort of fiscal reform needs to be passed. There hasn't been a collaborative stance, that nothing has been able to be worked out in terms of a political accord that would lead to these decisions being passed through Congress.
Just to take a couple of the policy issues. On Chiapas, in effect, he was willing to give more to Subcomandante Marcos and his followers than his alleged supporters in Congress were willing to grant. On fiscal reform, it is my understanding that one of the key issues is whether the value-added tax, a kind of sales tax, is to be applied to food and medicine. That seems like a big issue. I mean, I can understand how some might be concerned about stability or not, or giving away too much in Chiapas if you follow the example of Colombia. But it seems to me that the question of fiscal reform is a very straightforward social issue that you either manage or don't.
Well, I think Vicente Fox discovered upon arrival into office that many of the programs that he'd promised needed funding, and that the only way to provide those funds would be through a fiscal reform that would provide the government with more revenue. And therefore, he turned fiscal reform into one of the pillars of his administration. He has not been able to enact it, largely because of opposition to the value-added tax on medicines and food, a stance that many party politicians do not want to support for the political cost that that would entail to them in future elections. And Fox up to now has said, well, given that this is the pillar of my administration and I want to push it forward, I'm willing to pact with whoever can and does want to do so. And this has led for him to make a key decision: to pact with the PRI, to pact with the past, to pact with the once ruling party, and to give the PRI essentially everything it wants at the bargaining table in order to bring it on board. And this means that fiscal reform may be passed this term, this congressional term, but it may end up being a very diluted version of what he had initially proposed, because the PRI will say, I will support you, but give me many other things in return.
I would also add, too, Peter, I agree with what Denise is saying, but it also should be understood that this is, all of these problems are part of a larger context in which there is an exchange of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and even very recently increase in influence from the judicial branch. And because people have no prior experience in those sorts of negotiations, it's almost as if everybody is operating in a sort of unexplored territory as far as how they should relate to each other, how they should negotiate and work out these very significant policy compromises.
But there are decisions he's made, and the question I want to ask you, Rod, is whether he could or should have done things differently. One is to say fiscal reform of this sort is a pillar of my presidency. That's quite a conservative position. He's also said that privatization of the electricity business is going to be part of his principal agenda. That's another conservative position. He has taken out positions that he didn't have to take out, and now he's made this or promised this kind of compromise with the PRI of the formerly ruling party. I mean, he didn't have to do those things. In hindsight, could he have done things a little differently?
Well, I agree with you that he didn't necessarily have to do those things, but I think part of the problem is that the two other parties, one of which his party, the National Action Party, would have to form a coalition with, as Denise suggests, are staking out political territory on the left, the center left. And PRI just recently had an assembly where it became very clear from the nearly 12,000 delegates who were there that they want to reorient the party on the left and include policies that are sort of state-initiated, which sort of harkens back to what government philosophy was like in Mexico 30, 40 years ago. And that's fascinating because the public views the PRI as a party of the far right, the PAN as a party of the center right, and the PRD, the third party, is on the left. So there's a disjointed element there between how the public identifies itself. By the way, they tend to identify themselves as center to center right. So in a way, Fox has staked out the right territory in the right direction, but now he's getting two parties who want to establish themselves as sort of polar opposites on most of these policy issues. And that's going to make it more difficult rather than less difficult to come to some kind of compromise in order to get necessary legislation through Congress.
But Denise, if he didn't have a clear mandate on policy substance, if he was elected to be the Democrat who would overthrow the PRI, why did he stake out such controversial, in effect, conservative positions in a country where at least much of the political discourse, as Rod was saying, is really on the left, and where it seems to me that he could be vulnerable as being seen as too conservative?
Well, I don't think I'd classify Vicente Fox as a politician of the center-right or as a conservative. I think he's a pragmatist, and he tends to triangulate in the way that Bill Clinton did. He will offer something to the left and then offer something to the right, with the idea of ending up at the center of the political spectrum. And the problem with triangulating in Mexico is that frequently, if you offer something to the left and it doesn't work out, then the right is going to come back to hound you, which was what happened with Chiapas. He initially started off by giving the left Chiapas, saying we're going to bring about peace in the state, and then we'll get fiscal reform passed. Well, he's now put himself in a position where he hasn't satisfied anyone. And I think this is reflects to a large extent the circumstances under which he was elected. He forged a very disparate coalition that encompassed the left and the center and the right, and now he's having a hard time catering to the interests of all of the members of this disparate governing coalition.
Presumably, one of the kinds of mandates that he might have had would have been to deal with corruption and sort of clean government. Now, in October, there was an assassination of a human rights lawyer, Digna Ochoa, in Mexico City. And there is some clamor, I understand, for a more thorough investigation, particularly of the military. And at least the latest I saw was that there was some dissatisfaction with his reaction to this. Is this a potentially explosive issue?
Well, I think it reveals an unresolved tension in the Fox administration. Up to now, Fox has decided to follow a policy of appeasement with the PRI and with the past, and therefore not delve into corruption issues, into past abuses. One of his campaign promises was to create a truth commission, and he has refused to do so, in part because the people who are in charge of negotiating fiscal reform for him in Congress are telling him, if you pursue the PRI will not support us on fiscal reform. And over the last several days, we've seen changes in that position. Fox's government made public a report of the National Human Rights Commission detailing what had happened to over 500 people who disappeared in the dirty wars of the 70s. And Fox has now suggested that he's going to establish the figure of a special prosecutor to delve into those abuses. That might suggest that perhaps the Fox administration is going to rethink its strategy towards the PRI, that they may have realized we've been trying to bring them on board, we've given them everything they've wanted, they are now rebuilding themselves as a party, and they haven't given us anything. Perhaps we should use a different sort of strategy. Perhaps we should threaten them with a truth commission in order to get what we want. And therefore you might see a cleaning up of Mexico's past and an effort of the Fox administration to rebuild some credibility in that regard.
Let me bring this back to the question of his personality, Rod. He presents himself in some ways as this swashbuckling, powerful, tall, dynamic, strong, charismatic figure. But is he really willing to undertake the kind of confrontation that putting through some of these measures might suggest? It seems as though what we've been saying is that he's been walking on eggs for the first year. He's been very careful not to offend too many people, that he's sort of softened his positions, he's negotiating with the devil, etc. This does not sound like a powerful, swashbuckling figure. And is this paradox one that is beginning to emerge in at least his own behavior and in the eyes of Mexican citizens?
I think you're right about that. I think his personality sort of presents itself as somebody who is very demonstrative, who will make strong public statements, and then when he, either because of criticism that appears in the media or perhaps more likely advice from his closest cabinet members, he'll change his position and backpedal and take a step back. And I think he's done this over and over again. He did it during the campaign, so this is not something new to governance as compared to running a campaign. And I think that as a consequence, he's got a problem in terms of knowing how to be proactive as far as building political alliances, although, interestingly enough, as governor of his home state, Guanajuato, he was very successful in doing that on the state level with the state legislature, but has been unable to do it on the national level. So I think it's a serious problem in terms of both his political style and the direction that he would take as providing sort of the leadership to bring not only Congress together, but his own cabinet together on these significant issues.
Some people have said, Denise, that one of his assets as a leader, his background, his business, is in some ways a deficit, that he stakes out a position, declares that this is position, and expects it to be done. And it doesn't happen. So some are saying that, in effect, he makes all these pronouncements, but he's not a sort of an active politician like, say, Lyndon Johnson, that he doesn't sort of get things done. Is this a fair characterization?
I think it's a fair one, and one that bodes negatively for the Fox presidency. It's his Achilles heel. I think he envisioned the presidency as an office similar to that of the CEO of a company, whereby he'd be the public persona, the person who did the marketing for the government, and he would delegate responsibility for decision-making to his underlings in the cabinet. But it turns out that he needs to be making decisions, and frequently he doesn't make them, or he's torn between contending advice. And there is a cleavage in the Fox administration today between those who whisper into his left ear and say, pact with the PRI, and those who whisper into his right ear and say, be aggressive, do away with the ruling party, divide it, let's negotiate with moderate elements in the PRI, but let's really commit ourselves to the change agenda. And therefore what you see in him is a bit of a schizophrenic attitude towards change. Audaciousness on the one hand and extreme caution on the other. And he doesn't seem to enjoy the behind-the-scenes negotiation, politicking, deal brokering that successful presidencies entail. He likes the public aspect of it, the ceremony, the public presidency, being in the media, giving interviews, marketing his programs. And I think that has to do with his past professional incarnation at the helm of Coca-Cola. There he marketed the product. He didn't have to participate in the creation of its formula.
It sounds almost like he'd like to be a president in the European sense, and he needs a prime minister, you know, to do some of the nitty-gritty work. And let me follow up on this, Rod, by asking you about his prospective relations with Congress. His relations with his own party are a little tenuous because he distanced himself from the PAN. His relations with the PRI are undergoing some change, et cetera. Do you foresee between now and the congressional elections of the coming year a major change, or is this politics of stalemate going to continue?
Well, I think that the most important thing that might happen as a result of those elections, given what has happened within the PRI itself in terms of its party leadership, that if it really does stake out this position on the left and run on that strategy, and if the economy continues to be extremely difficult in growth, basically zero, and Fox is unable to implement a number of these policies, and PRI is successful at least in maintaining its current level, in fact possibly increasing that level in Congress, it's likely to make it more difficult rather than less difficult for him to negotiate a compromise. And I think that's going to create some serious problems for him, particularly if PRI sees itself as making a substantial comeback at the national congressional level in order to position itself for the 2006 presidential
Right,
race.
we're talking about congressional elections of 2003, and noting parenthetically that the PRI, which some people thought was going to vanish after losing the presidency, is still alive, if not totally well, and at least can block some of these initiatives. Denise, let me ask you about another gamble he made, which is to rely very heavily on his relationship with the United States, particularly with George W. Bush. How has that paid off for him over the course of the year, both before and after September 11th?
Well, I think it paid off very well initially because he was viewed in Mexico as someone who was setting the agenda, who had put a proposal for an immigration accord on the table, and that the Bush administration was forced into taking him seriously and to starting up a very complex negotiating process that would have borne fruits probably sometime next year. The attacks of September 11th have put the whole immigration negotiation on the back burner. And what the Fox administration has discovered is, much to its chagrin, is that Mexico is now at the bottom rung of the totem pole in terms of American priorities. Fox also discovered quite painfully after September 11th that Mexican public opinion wasn't completely united, at least not at the elite level, united behind this pro-American president. Indeed,
partly on the issue of the terrorist attacks themselves and what Mexico's response ought to be. There was some uncertainty about that.
No, his Minister of Foreign Affairs came out very quickly and said, we strongly and unconditionally support the U.S. and the U.S.'s right to retaliate. And this raised many eyebrows in Mexico, particularly among nationalist politicians. And because Fox was in the midst of negotiating fiscal reform, some of the members of his cabinet said, back away from that position. And therefore, Fox, for at least a week, disappeared. If you look back at how other international leaders responded to the event, they did so in a very strong fashion. And yet, Mexico's president, who had marketed himself as the closest friend of the United States, suddenly became the invisible man.
So Mexico has become a political democracy, and yet it also confronts the uncertainty and the vulnerability of reliance on the United States, and retains in some ways its nationalist self. Thanks both of you, Rod, thanks Denise. Next up, we turn from politics to the golden age of Mexican cinema with Graciela Sevilla.
The golden age of Mexican cinema captured the imaginations of moviegoers across Latin America from the 1930s through the early 1950s. The movie industry flourished while producing love stories built around beautiful, sultry heroines, dramas filled with bold and dashing leading men, and serving up social commentary through outrageous comic characters. At the time, Mexican directors rivaled Hollywood in turning out as many as 100 films in a year. Along the way, they created legendary stars such as Cantinflas, Maria Felix, and Tintin. Joining me tonight to discuss the highlights of the golden age of Mexican cinema is Fred Daub, whose public lectures are popular with movie buffs across California. Welcome, Fred.
Hi.
Tell me a little bit about the forces that came together to give rise to the golden age of Mexican cinema.
A combination of talent, really. Talent at all levels, acting, directing, and producing. Many of the people who were very, very active in this age of Mexican cinema had studied with great Russian, German, and American directors, and a number of the actors and directors even worked in Hollywood.
Was there something about the period that made this a particularly fertile creative time?
It was a time of growing nationalism in Mexico and of a cementing of the identity of just who was Mexican and what Mexican culture consisted of. And into this arena came greats like Emilio El Indio Fernandez, who established on film the images that came to represent Mexico and the Mexican people.
And he was one of the more successful directors, right?
Very much so.
Okay, and these were some of the themes that he would play off of in his movies?
His themes were national identity, the struggle of the classes, public education, the movement to improve living conditions for people in Mexico, and perhaps more than anything else, Emilio Fernandez established a reputation for portraying the people of the countryside and the indigenous population. Dolores Del Rio is an interesting case in the sense that she became a star first in the United States, and when her career was fading a bit in Hollywood, she decided to accept El Indio Fernandez's offer to come back to Mexico in 1934 and star in the movie Flor Silvestre. And from there on, she established herself as the face of Mexican cinema. She was bilingual. She had been living in Hollywood, returned to Mexico, and then near the end of her career, she came back to Hollywood and did other movies and American television.
She was a rather important star in Hollywood, wasn't she?
One of the few Hollywood stars who was able to move successfully from the silent era to talking films.
And she had a number of major roles, but even so, it seems that she rarely played a Mexican woman. What kind of roles was she given instead?
We say that Dolores Del Rio was often used to represent the exotic other in Hollywood movies. And by that we mean everything other than Anglo-Saxon American. She played Indians, she played Polynesians. For example, in the movie Bird of Paradise, she was the Bird of Paradise and spoke in a Polynesian language. She played Brazilians, she played anything other than American, and sometimes she played Latinas, sometimes she played Mexicans. She often had roles as the Spanish dancer as well.
We have a clip from one of her early movies, Flying Down to Rio.
You know, if a Brazilian girl was half as interested in him as you are, and had half your freedom,
She'd what?
she'd get him over here, just for you.
Oh, yeah? You mean she'd try?
Watch me.
He just fell into the trombone.
Now we see her here playing a rather glamorous socialite, but this was quite different from the types of roles she was given in her Mexican movies, isn't that right?
That's true. We have a quote from her in which she says that when she went back to Mexico, she changed her pearls and furs for sandals and very humble dress for rebozo, because she was often given indigenous roles in Mexican film. A great irony, because she was from a privileged background in Mexico, and the film that we just saw is one in which she plays something more or less parallel to her real life.
To where she came from.
Yes.
I think she had a lot of versatility, and toward the end of her career, I found an interesting clip of her playing Elvis Presley's mother in one of his movies. I'm not sure that Flaming Star was one of her shining moments, but that was an interesting one to find.
I'm surprised you say that. They say that that was Elvis's best role, so maybe Dolores Del Rio as a supporting actress contributed to that. A curious thing about that film is that it explores ethnic relations between American Indians and white settlers in the area. And Dolores Del Rio has a very pivotal role there because she represents an Indian woman who's married to a white settler, and Elvis Presley himself plays a person who is mixed race. And so in that sense, she was used as an intermediary or a buffer in the relationships in a very tense settlement situation.
Well, the Golden Age also gave us another important diva in Maria Felix, whose beauty was legendary as well as her movies, and she inspired many painters and composers. What was it about her that captivated the imagination?
It is her beauty. It is a very strong personality. It's the independent feminist in her that inspired so many creative forces. One who we need to mention is her former husband, Agustin Lara, who wrote the famous bolero Maria Bonita for her. And she says that's an eternal gift that was given to her. She's still alive, of course, and still does make public appearances.
Living now in France much of the time?
Most of the time, and she's heavily criticized in Mexico for doing that. She also has homes in Mexico.
You've mentioned before in some of your lectures that she played rather strong characters, very much unlike the traditional roles that women had in Mexico at the time. What was the significance of that?
Her popularity in many ways is attributable to the fact that she went totally against type of the Mexican woman as the suffering person, or the woman who was done in by a man, or the virgin, whore, saint type of roles. She was strong, she knew what she wanted, and no man ever took advantage of her, at least in the movies.
So did she have a lot of fans among women as well as men then?
Yes, and even today, when I show her films to audiences, especially of high school girls, they recognize in her something they find very admirable, and that is she stood up for what she wanted, and she expressed her thoughts.
Well, she managed to become a very big star, even though, unlike Dolores Del Rio, she never made a movie in Hollywood. How did that come about?
She fought Hollywood in many ways. She did not accept any of the roles that were offered to her, saying they were demeaning, and instead went to Europe, where she was known as La Mexicana, the woman who represented Mexico to them. And she appeared in several very successful French movies, and through that vehicle she became an international star.
Well, we have a really nice clip from her early career, from Rio Escondido.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the role that she plays in this movie.
In this movie, she portrays a heroic teacher who is sent by none less than the President of Mexico to a town that's ruled viciously by a very dictatorial man who's never allowed a public school to flourish there. She's a woman with a heart condition, and despite that, she takes on this challenge. And in the clip we're going to see, she is a teacher on the first day of school with her new students.
Presente.
Tlahuantzin Cándido.
Presente.
Velardeña Gregorio.
Presente.
Sontle Macrina.
Presente.
Esta es la primera letra del alfabeto. Se llama A. Repitan conmigo. A.
The best-known actor to come out of Mexico from that era was Cantinflas, an interesting comic who played a number of roles both in Hollywood and in Mexico. Tell us about the character that he created.
Mario Moreno created a personality that comes right out of the urban milieu of Mexico City, of the person who came from the countryside to a confusing urban scene and tries to get along to survive in that scene. The character himself is the person known as the pelado, the peladito.
Sort of a rascal,
a rascal, a pícaro, but also a man who is the very bottom of the social scale, who has no resources and no one's helping him. The only thing he has to get by, his wits and his verbosity, and he uses them both to very good effect.
Well, Cantinflas was really one of the more beloved characters, wasn't he, to come out of the Mexican movies, so much so that we have a little doll here that you brought today. Tell us a little bit about what he's got on and who he's pretending to be.
This is the Cantinflas character. The hat, the little bit of mustache, the scarf, and this rag here, which is sort of like representing a coat. And he's representative of a lot of the memorabilia that you can still buy with Cantinflas' image. After all, this was an image that was used to sell cars, sodas, cigarettes, and a lot of other things. So it's a fairly common image. On most streets that sell arts and crafts in Mexico, you will find a Cantinflas marionette or statuette. When kids appear at home with their pants down low, very often their parents will say to them, "You look like Cantinflas." And sure enough, they do.
Now, there was another male star, Germán Valdés Tintán.
Germán Valdés Tintán took the personality that he saw in the border areas of the Pachuco and introduced that character of the Zoot Suiter into Mexican film, combining Spanish with words and slang from English and the typical dress of the pachuco, the zoot suit, and high energy. Lots and lots of dancing, singing. He was a very talented personality. And in fact, we see his figure, the pachuco, reflected in such contemporary movies as The Mask with Jim Carrey, in which the dance scene of the pachuco in the nightclub, that is Tintin, that is copied from Tintin. Also, Luis Valdez's film from the 1980s, Zoot Suit, brings us back to the times of Tintin and his image on the screen.
There's so many films and so many stars and directors that this golden age gave us. What was it that finally brought the curtain down on La Época Dorada?
I would say economic factors. During the war, the United States gave Mexico a lot of film stock to be used in making the films. But after the war, that stopped because Hollywood wanted to regain supremacy in the world market, especially in Latin America. Before the Época de Oro, the United States films were far more prevalent and seen in many more theaters than Mexican films. During the war, not so. Mexican film industry gained dominance once again. And American money was invested in Mexican film industry. But as I say, after the war, the desire by the American media giants to control the cinema left Mexico behind. And also, things were getting a bit stale. The formula films of Cantinflas were losing their popularity. The same stars were getting older. And many criticized Mexican film industry people because new talent was not allowed to thrive. New directors, new actors were not given a chance. There was a reliance on the same old formula, and the same old formula wasn't working as far as competing for public interest with foreign film, American and European film.
Well, after a long dormant period or a time not at center stage, it seems like Mexican movies have been regaining attention, starting with Like Water for Chocolate and some of the newer movies, Amores Perros, that was nominated for an Oscar last year. Do you think there's a chance we could see a second golden era?
Yes. In a recent article in the New York Times, they talk about the new golden age of Mexican cinema, the new Mexican revolution in film. And what we find that these are movies which are showing the violent and often chaotic and tumultuous times that Mexico is living through right now.
My thanks to you, Fred Dobb, for helping us uncover some of the treasures of Mexico's golden age of cinema. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Finally tonight, celebrating Christmas in Castro's Cuba. The holiday season is here. In Latin America, with its profound Catholic tradition, this means a time of reflection, worship, and celebration. Celebration of family, celebration of love, celebration of hope. In countries such as Mexico, the festivities begin in mid-December with Las Posadas, a reenactment of Joseph and Mary's search for a place at an inn, and they extend all the way to January 6th, El Día de los Reyes Magos, in honor of the three wise men, and their traditional day for gift-giving. Mercifully, Christmas in most of Latin America is not the commercial bonanza that it has become in the United States. Not yet, anyway. And it remains a season rich in symbolic ritual and spiritual substance. Nowhere is the holiday more poignant than in Cuba, where the observance of Christmas was officially abolished by the government in 1969, partly in deference to Marxist doctrine, and partly to keep people working toward the ultimately unsuccessful goal of a 10 million ton sugar harvest for 1969-70. Of course, many Cuban families retained their religious beliefs and continued to celebrate Christmas Eve in spite of the prohibition. But traditions weakened over the years. Christmas then came out of the closet just a few years ago in a one-time favor to Pope John Paul II, who made a memorable visit to the island in 1998. Christmas was that year declared a temporary holiday. The gesture was so popular that it was made permanent thereafter. As a result of this background, Christmas in Cuba has distinctive features. For one thing, the figure of Santa Claus remains a mystery to many Cubans, especially to the young. Second, gift-giving remains at modest levels, due largely to economic scarcity. Third, the festivities tend to emphasize social disparities, disparities the government would rather not recognize. Most families can manage to buy rum and beer and even roast pork for the Christmas Eve meal, but only those who have dollars to spend in hard currency stores are able to obtain imported liquors and delicacies. Yet the regime is attempting not only to tolerate the Christmas holiday, but also to embrace it. This is not as strange as it might seem. Indeed, liberation theology represents a blend of Marxist social categories with Christian theological doctrine, and it remains strong and significant throughout Latin America. And despite the resurgence of Christmas, it is still the New Year's Eve feast, which happens to coincide with the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, that remains the most important celebration throughout the country. By a stroke of sheer luck, it seems, Fidel was thus able to take advantage of the historic holiday season. There are, of course, political factors at work here. In effect, Fidel Castro struck a bargain with the Pope. He would allow Christmas celebrations and public masses in exchange for recognition of his regime and a call for a change in U.S. policy. The Cuban government has also denounced Yuletide extravagance as a sign of the crass materialism of American society. A case in point was that of Elian Gonzalez, the young boy found clinging to an inner tube off the Florida shore, who was showered by gifts from anti-Castro sympathizers during Christmas of 1999. On a more human note, it is profoundly painful for Cubans to acknowledge that so many families are separated, with cousins, brothers, even spouses and children living in Florida or elsewhere in the United States. So we acknowledge the poignancy of the season for Cuba, for Latin America, and for a world now at war. We also join in expressions of hope, compassion, desires for peace, and belief in human capacity for goodness. We close this edition of HemiScope by wishing a happy holiday season to all peoples of all faiths. I'm Peter Smith. Thank you, and good night.